Sarah Chun's silver bracelet caught the light one last time as she waved goodbye to her mother, the delicate charm shaped like a piano key glinting in the afternoon sun. It was October 15th, 2010, and the 16-year-old had been walking the same route to Mrs. Whitmore's piano studio for 3 years. She never made it to her lesson that day, and the bracelet, a gift from her grandmother on her 13th birthday, would remain hidden beneath the floorboards of St. Michael's Lutheran Church for 14 long years. Detective Marcus Rivera had seen enough missing person cases to know that hope was a dangerous thing. It kept families suspended in limbo, unable to grieve, unable to move forward. But when construction workers renovating the old church called his precinct about finding jewelry beneath the sanctuary floor, something in his gut told him this wasn't just another cold case about to be closed. The bracelet lay in an evidence bag on his desk, tarnished but unmistakable. The piano key charm had been photographed hundreds of times during the initial investigation, plastered on missing person flyers throughout the small town of Millbrook. Rivera had been a rookie then, barely 3 months on the force when Sarah disappeared. Now, at 38, he was the lead detective on a case that had haunted him for more than a decade. The weight of those 14 years pressed down on him like a physical burden. He joined the police force with idealistic dreams of serving and protecting, of bringing justice to those who needed it most. Sarah Chun's case had been his first major assignment, and his failure to solve it had shaped every investigation that followed. He'd solved dozens of cases since then, earned commendations and the respect of his peers. But the ghost of Sarah Chun followed him everywhere. His partner, Detective Linda Walsh, knocked on his office door. At 42, she was 10 years his senior in age, but had started her detective career 5 years after him. She'd transferred from the narcotics division after a shooting incident left her with PTSD and a desperate need for a fresh start. Their partnership had been born out of mutual respect and shared trauma. Two cops who understood that the job took pieces of your soul and rarely gave them back. "The Chun family is here," Walsh said softly. "Are you ready for this?" Rivera nodded, though he wasn't sure anyone could be ready for what was about to happen. Elena Chun had aged 20 years in the 14 that had passed since her daughter's disappearance. When Sarah vanished, Elena had been a vibrant 38-year-old marketing executive with a bright smile and an unshakable faith in the goodness of the world. The woman who sat across from him now looked like a shell of her former self. Elena Chun's marriage to David Chun had ended 3 years after Sarah's disappearance. The strain of not knowing, of hoping and despairing in equal measure, had proven too much for their relationship. They'd tried counseling, support groups, even a brief separation that they'd hoped would give them perspective. But in the end, they'd found that their grief was too different, their coping mechanisms too incompatible. David had thrown himself into work, accepting a transfer to the company's Portland office and starting a new life where Sarah's absence wasn't a constant reminder. Elena had done the opposite, refusing to leave Millbrook, convinced that if she stayed, if she kept searching, she would somehow find her daughter. She'd quit her job, spent their savings on private investigators, and devoted every waking moment to the search. The divorce had been finalized 6 years ago, but Elena still wore her wedding ring, not out of hope for reconciliation, but because removing it felt like another betrayal of the family they'd once been. She'd kept the house on Maple Street, the same house where Sarah had practiced piano in the living room, where her daughter's bedroom remained exactly as she'd left it on that October morning. "Mrs. Chun," Rivera said gently, "I need you to look at this bracelet and tell me if you can identify it." Alana's hands shook as she reached for the evidence bag. The moment she saw the piano key charm, she let out a sound that was part sob, part gasp. She dreamed of this moment for 14 years, had imagined every possible scenario of how Sarah's belongings might be found. But nothing had prepared her for the reality of holding this piece of her daughter's life again. "It's Sarah's," she whispered. "My mother gave it to her for her 13th birthday. Sarah wore it every day." Elena's voice broke. "She said it brought her luck with her piano playing." Rivera made notes as Elena told him about the bracelet's history. Sarah's grandmother, Mei Lin Chun, had been a piano teacher in Taiwan before. Immigrating to America in the 1970s, she'd saved for months to buy the bracelet, having it specially made at a local jewelry store. The piano key charm was unique, crafted by a jeweler who specialized in musical instruments. "Sarah loved her grandmother so much," Elena continued. "Mei Lin died when Sarah was 15, just a year before she disappeared," Sarah said. The bracelet was her way of keeping her grandmother's memory alive. The discovery of the bracelet had already begun to ripple through the small town of Millbrook. Word traveled fast in a community of just over 12,000 people, and Sarah Chun's disappearance had been the biggest story in the town's recent history. The local newspaper, the Millbrook Gazette, had run weekly updates for the first year. After Sarah vanished, then monthly updates for the next 2 years. Even after the official investigation had gone cold, the paper had continued to run annual remembrance pieces on the anniversary of her disappearance. Jenny Morrison, the current editor of the Gazette, had been a junior reporter when Sarah disappeared. She'd covered the story from the beginning, interviewed the family dozens of times, and had never quite been able to let go of the case. When news of the bracelet's discovery broke, she was the first reporter to arrive at the police station. Her press credentials and years of relationship building with the department giving her access that other journalists couldn't match. "Detective Rivera," she called out as he left the station that evening. "Can you confirm that the bracelet belongs to Sarah Chun?" Rivera paused at his car door. Jenny Morrison was persistent but fair, and she'd been respectful to the Chun family throughout the ordeal. He'd learned to trust her with information that he wouldn't share with other reporters. "Off the record?" he asked. Jenny nodded. "For now, it's hers. Elena Chun confirmed it this afternoon." Jenny felt a chill run down her spine. She'd been 26 when Sarah disappeared, fresh out of journalism school and eager to make a name for herself. The story had consumed her. For years, not just professionally but personally, she'd spent countless hours with the Chun family, had watched Elena's slow deterioration, had seen how the mystery had torn the community apart. "Where was it found?" she asked. "St. Michael's Lutheran Church, hidden beneath the sanctuary floor." Jenny's mind raced. The church was less than a mile from Mrs. Whitmore's piano studio, but it was slightly off the direct route Sarah would have taken. Why would her bracelet be there? And why hidden beneath the floorboards? Meanwhile, at St. Michael's Lutheran Church, Father Thomas Brennan was conducting his weekly Bible study session, but his mind was elsewhere. The elderly priest had been struggling with the implications of the bracelet's discovery since the moment it was found. He'd been at the church for over 20 years, and in that time, he'd seen it as a sanctuary, a place of peace and worship. The idea that it might have been connected to Sarah Chun's disappearance was deeply troubling. Father Brennan was a tall, thin man with silver hair and kind eyes that had seen their share of human suffering. He'd come to Millbrook from a larger parish in the state capital, seeking a quieter life where he could focus on pastoral care rather than administrative duties. He'd found that peace at St. Michael's, building relationships with his parishioners and serving as a counselor and confidant to many in the community. The church itself was a beautiful example of Gothic revival architecture, built in 1887 and carefully maintained over the decades. The sanctuary could seat about 200 people, with stunning stained glass windows that cast colored light across the wooden pews. The pipe organ was the church's pride and joy, a magnificent instrument that had been installed in the 1920s and meticulously maintained by a series of skilled organists. The renovation that had led to the bracelet's discovery had been Father Brennan's idea. The church's heating system was ancient and inefficient, and the floorboards in the sanctuary were showing their age. The church council had initially balked at the expense, but Father Brennan had argued that the improvements were necessary to preserve the building for future generations. The work had begun 3 weeks earlier, with a crew from Millbrook Construction, carefully removing the old floorboards and installing new heating ducts. It was on the second day of work that they'd found the bracelet, wrapped in a piece of cloth and hidden in a small cavity near the altar. Margaret Sullivan, the church secretary, had been the first person Father Brennan called when the discovery was made. Margaret had been with the church for 15 years, starting as a volunteer and gradually taking on more responsibilities until she became indispensable. She was a woman in her mid-40s, unmarried and deeply devoted to her faith and her church family. Margaret had a detailed knowledge of the church's history and operations that rivaled Father Brennan's own. She maintained the member database, coordinated volunteers, managed the church calendar, and handled much of the day-to-day administrative work. She was also known for her excellent memory and her ability to connect seemingly unrelated pieces of information. When the police began their investigation, Margaret was one of the first people they interviewed. She provided them with detailed records of everyone who had regular access to the sanctuary, including parishioners, staff, and outside contractors. She also shared her observations about any unusual activity or behavior she'd noticed over the years. "I've been trying to remember anything unusual from around 2010, Margaret told Detective Walsh during their interview. That was such a difficult time for our community. Everyone was so worried about Sarah, and there was this sense of, I don't know, like innocence had been lost." Walsh took notes as Margaret continued. "We had increased security around the church after Sarah disappeared. Father Brennan was concerned about the safety of our young people, especially the girls. We started locking the sanctuary when it wasn't in use, and we implemented a buddy system for youth activities." The interview revealed that the church had been quite active in the search for Sarah. Many parishioners had joined the volunteer search teams, and the church had served as a coordination center for some of the search efforts. They'd also held several prayer vigils and memorial services for Sarah. Even though the Chun family wasn't part of their congregation, Detective Rivera spent the next several days interviewing current and former church members, staff, and volunteers. The list was extensive, and many of the people he spoke with had moved away from Millbrook in the years since Sarah's disappearance. The process was painstaking, but Rivera was determined to follow every lead. One of the most interesting interviews was with Robert Kellerman, who had been the church's head usher in 2010. Kellerman was a retired accountant who had moved to Millbrook with his wife in 2005. He was a meticulous man who kept detailed records of his volunteer activities, including notes about unusual incidents or concerns. "I remember October 15th, 2010, Kellerman told Rivera. It was a Friday, and we were preparing for the Harvest Festival that weekend. I was at the church from about noon until 8 o'clock that evening, helping with decorations and setup." Rivera leaned forward. "Did you notice anything unusual that day? Anyone who wasn't supposed to be there?" Kellerman consulted his notes. "Actually, yes. I saw a pickup truck parked behind the church around 4:30 that afternoon. It wasn't familiar to me, and it was parked in an odd spot, almost hidden behind the trees. I made a note to mention it to Father Brennan, but then I got distracted with other tasks." "Can you describe the truck?" "It was dark-colored, maybe blue or black. Older model, probably from the late 1990s or early 2000s. I remember thinking it looked like a work truck, not something a parishioner would drive." Rivera felt his pulse quicken. Sarah had disappeared around 4:30 that afternoon, and the Chiaster church was only about 6 blocks from Mrs. Whitmore's piano studio. The timing was too coincidental to ignore that Mrs. Dorothy Whitmore was now 73 years old, living alone in the same house where she'd taught piano for 4 decades. Her arthritis had forced her to retire from teaching 5 years earlier, but she still played for her own enjoyment when her hands weren't too painful. The living room that had once echoed with the sounds of student recitals was now quiet most of the time, the baby grand piano standing like a monument to a lifetime of musical education. When Detective Walsh arrived for their interview, Mrs. Whitmore was sitting at the piano, slowly working through a simplified arrangement of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the piece Sarah had been preparing for her recital. "I play it sometimes," Mrs. Whitmore said softly. "It helps me remember her. Sarah had such a gift, Detective. Not just technical skill, but real musical intuition. She could make the piano sing." Walsh settled into the chair across from Mrs. Whitmore, noting the photographs on the piano that showed decades of student recitals. Sarah's photo was prominently displayed, a formal portrait from her last recital 6 months before she disappeared. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need to ask you about the day Sarah disappeared. You were expecting her for a lesson that afternoon?" "Yes, at 5 o'clock. She was always punctual, never missed a lesson without calling first." Mrs. Whitmore's voice wavered with emotion. "I waited until almost 6:30 that evening. I kept thinking she'd forgotten, or maybe she was sick. It never occurred to me that something terrible had happened." Walsh asked about Sarah's routine, her typical route to and from lessons, and whether she'd ever mentioned any concerns about her safety. Mrs. Whitmore explained that Sarah usually walked the most direct route from her house to the studio, a path that would take her down Maple Street to Oak Avenue, then left on Oak to the studio. "She never mentioned feeling unsafe," Mrs. Whitmore said. "Millbrook was such a quiet town then. We all felt safe walking anywhere, even after dark." Sarah was a sensible girl, very responsible. But as the interview continued, Mrs. Whitmore remembered something that made Walsh sit up straighter. "There was something," she said slowly. "Maybe a month before she disappeared, Sarah mentioned hearing someone playing the organ at St. Michael's Church. She said she'd been walking past and heard Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor. She was curious about it because she'd never heard that particular piece before." Walsh felt a chill. "Did she say anything else about the church?" "She asked if I could teach her to play the piece. I told her it was too advanced for her level at the time, but I promised we'd work on it once she mastered the Chopin." She was disappointed, but she understood. The organ detail was potentially significant. St. Michael's had one of the finest pipe organs in the county, and only a handful of people were skilled enough to play Bach's Toccata and Fugue properly. The piece was technically demanding, requiring advanced pedal technique and precise timing. Father Brennan was the most obvious suspect. He was an accomplished organist who had studied music in seminary. But when Rivera checked his alibi for October 15th, 2010, he found that the priest had been at a clergy conference in the state capitol that day, with dozens of witnesses and hotel records to confirm his whereabouts. The church's music director at the time had been Charles Hoffman, a man in his mid-50s who had held the position for 8 years when Sarah disappeared. Hoffman was known throughout the community for his exceptional skill at the organ and his somewhat reclusive personality. He lived alone, had never married, and was intensely private about his personal life. Rivera and Walsh drove to Hoffman's house on Thursday evening, expecting to find a man who might have answers about Sarah's disappearance. Instead, they found a tragic figure ravaged by early-onset Alzheimer's disease. The man who answered the door was clearly Charles Hoffman, but he was a shadow of his former self. At 67, he appeared much older, his eyes vacant and confused. His sister Ruth had been caring for him for the past 3 years, watching helplessly as the disease stole his memories and his ability to function independently. Charles was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's 6 years ago, Ruth explained sadly. He had to resign from the church when he could no longer remember the music. It was heartbreaking to watch. Music was his whole life. Walsh asked if Charles remembered anything about October 15th, 2010, but it was clear that he was no longer capable of providing coherent answers. Ruth explained that her brother's condition had deteriorated rapidly, and he now required full-time care. He doesn't remember most of his time at the church, Ruth said. The disease has taken so much from him. He sometimes tries to play piano, but his fingers can't remember the movements anymore. Another dead end. Rivera was beginning to wonder if they'd ever uncover the truth about Sarah's disappearance, even with the bracelet as evidence. But he wasn't ready to give up. Too many families had been left without answers. Too many cases had gone cold because investigators had stopped pushing when the leads dried up. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret Sullivan, the church secretary, had been quietly conducting her own investigation since the bracelet was discovered. She'd been at St. Michael's longer than almost anyone, and she knew every secret the old building held. The discovery of the bracelet had shaken her more than she'd let on, and she'd been spending her evenings going through old church records, looking for anything that might provide a clue. Margaret's dedication to the church went beyond her official duties. She'd appointed herself as the unofficial historian of St. Michael's, maintaining detailed records of events, repairs, and changes to the building over the years. She had boxes of receipts, correspondence, and photographs that documented decades of church life. It was in a box of financial records from 2010 that she found it. Receipt for emergency floorboard repairs, dated October 20th, 2010, just 5 days after Sarah's disappearance. The work had been done by Millbrook Construction, the same company that was doing the current renovation. But the invoice was signed by someone she didn't recognize, David Hoffman. Margaret stared at the receipt for several minutes, her mind racing. Hoffman was the same last name as Charles, the former music director. Could this be a relative? She'd never heard Charles mention her brother, but the connection was too significant to ignore. Margaret called Detective Rivera immediately, her voice shaking with excitement. "I found something," she said. "A receipt for floorboard repairs in 2010. It was done by someone named David Hoffman, and the work was done on October 20th, just 5 days after Sarah disappeared." Rivera felt his pulse quicken. David Hoffman? Any relation to Charles Hoffman? "I think so. The last name is the same, and the timing is too coincidental. I'm going to call Charles's sister and ask her about David." Within an hour, Rivera had confirmed that David Hoffman was indeed Charles's younger brother. Ruth Hoffman provided them with David's contact information and employment history. He'd been working as a carpenter for various construction companies around the county in 2010, specializing in renovation and repair work. David Hoffman was currently employed by Henderson Construction, working on a house renovation project on the outskirts of Millbrook. Rivera and Walsh found him at the job site, installing hardwood flooring in what would be the master bedroom of a restored Victorian home. At 46, David was still lean and strong, his hands scarred from years of construction work. He had the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades working outdoors, but there was something else in his expression, a wariness that suggested he'd been expecting this conversation for a long time. "David Hoffman?" Rivera showed his badge. "I'm Detective Rivera. This is Detective Walsh. We'd like to talk to you about some work you did at St. Michael's Lutheran Church in October 2010. David's face went pale. He set down his hammer and looked around the job site, as if calculating whether he could run. But after a moment, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I've been waiting for this day for 14 years, he said quietly. "I need you to come to the station with me, David," Rivera sighed. "We need to talk about St. Michael's Church and October 15th, 2010. The ride to the police station was conducted in silence. David sat in the back of the patrol car, staring out the window at the familiar streets of Millbrook. He'd lived in this town his entire life, had watched it grow and change over the decades. He'd worked on half the buildings in the downtown area, had left his mark on the community in ways both visible and invisible. The interview room at the Millbrook Police Department was a sterile, windowless space designed to encourage confessions. Rivera and Walsh had conducted hundreds of interviews in this room, but they both sensed that this one would be different. David Hoffman wasn't a career criminal or a practiced liar. He was a man who had been carrying a terrible secret for 14 years, and he was finally ready to let it go. "I need to tell you about my addiction first," David said, his voice barely above a whisper, "because none of this makes sense without that context." Rivera and Walsh listened as David explained his descent into prescription drug addiction in the late 2000s. It had started with legitimate pain medication after a construction accident injured his back. But when the prescription ran out, he'd found other ways to obtain the pills. By 2010, he was taking multiple pills daily, barely functioning at work, and spending most of his paycheck on drugs. "I was high more often than I was sober," David continued. "I should have been in treatment, but I was too proud to admit I had a problem. I thought I could handle it on my own." The confession came slowly, painfully, as David recounted the events of October 15th, 2010. He'd been working on a house renovation all morning, had taken too many pills during his lunch break, and was driving home when he decided to take a detour through downtown Millbrook. "I was driving down Maple Street, probably going too fast," he said. "I saw this girl walking on the sidewalk, wearing headphones, completely lost in her own world. She had this silver bracelet that caught the light, and I remember thinking how young she looked." Rivera felt his stomach tighten. "What happened next?" "She stepped into the crosswalk at Oak Avenue without looking. I tried to stop, but I was going too fast, and the pills. My reflexes were too slow. I hit her. The impact had been devastating. Sarah had been thrown nearly 20 feet, her body landing in the tall grass beside the road. David had pulled over immediately, his heart pounding, expecting to find a crowd of witnesses. But the street was empty. It was a Friday afternoon, and most people were at work or school. I got out of the truck and ran to her," David continued, tears streaming down his face. She was unconscious, but she was still breathing. There was blood coming from her head, and her left arm was bent at an odd angle. I knew she was hurt bad. David's first instinct had been to call 911, but panic had set in as he realized the implications. He'd been driving under the influence, had previous arrests for drug possession, and knew that hitting a pedestrian while high would likely result in a lengthy prison sentence. "I kept thinking about my brother Charles," David said. "He was the only family I had left, and I knew this would destroy him. He was so proud of his position at the church, so respected in the community. If I went to prison, it would ruin his reputation too." Instead of calling for help, David had made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He'd carefully lifted Sarah's unconscious body and placed her in the back of his pickup truck. She was still alive, still breathing, but clearly in need of immediate medical attention. "I drove around for maybe 10 minutes, trying to figure out what to do," David said. "I kept thinking maybe I could take her to the hospital and make up some story about finding her on the side of the road. But I was too high, too panicked to think clearly." David had eventually driven to St. Michael's Church, the only place he could think of where he might have privacy to figure out his next move. He'd done work at the church before, knew the layout, and had a key to the basement entrance that he'd forgotten to return after completing a repair job months earlier. I carried her down to the basement, David continued. It was quiet there, and I thought maybe if I could just give her time to wake up, I could figure out what to do next. Maybe she'd be okay, and I could take her to the hospital, and no one would have to know what really happened. Rivera and Walsh exchanged glances. This was the moment they'd been dreading, the revelation of what had happened to Sarah in those final hours. She never woke up, David said, his voice breaking. I sat with her for hours, watching her breathe, praying she'd open her eyes. But around midnight, she just stopped breathing. I tried CPR, but it was too late. The head injury from the impact had been fatal. Sarah had likely suffered a severe brain hemorrhage, and without immediate medical attention, she had no chance of survival. David's decision to hide her instead of calling 911 had sealed her fate. I stayed with her all night, David whispered. I couldn't leave her alone. I kept thinking about her family, about how they'd never know what happened to her. I thought about my brother Charles, about how this would destroy everything he'd worked for. As dawn broke on October 16th, David had faced another impossible choice. He couldn't leave Sarah's body in the church basement. It would be discovered eventually, and the investigation would lead back to him. But he couldn't bring himself to dispose of her body like she was garbage. I decided to bury her, David said. There's a wooded area behind the church property, about 50 yards from the building. I wrapped her body in a tarp and buried her there. It took me most of the morning, but David's guilt had been overwhelming. He'd taken Sarah's bracelet before burying her, unable to explain why. Later, when he'd returned to the church to do the emergency repair work on the water-damaged floorboards, he'd hidden the bracelet beneath the sanctuary floor. I wrote a note, David said. Just 2 words. Forgive me. I wanted her to know I was sorry. I wanted God to know I was sorry. The confession continued for hours as Rivera and Walsh asked for details about every aspect of the crime. David's account was consistent and detailed, clearly the result of 14 years of reliving those terrible events. He led them through his actions step by step, from the initial impact to the burial to the decision to hide the bracelet. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Walsh asked. Why wait 14 years? David was quiet for a long time. At first, I told myself I was protecting my brother. Charles had worked so hard to build his reputation, and I didn't want to destroy that. But as the years went by, I realized I was just protecting myself. David explained how he'd gotten clean. 6 years after Sarah's death, entering a treatment program and rebuilding his life. He'd been sober for 8 years now, had a steady job, and had even started dating someone seriously. But the guilt had never left him. I thought about confessing. Every single day, he said. I drove past the Chun family's house regularly, saw the missing person flyers with Sarah's picture. I watched Elena Chun deteriorate over the years, saw how the not knowing was destroying her. But I was too much of a coward to do the right thing. The confession shattered the Chun family. Elena collapsed when Rivera called to tell her what had happened to her daughter. She'd spent 14 years imagining every possible scenario: kidnapping, murder, runaway, accident, but the reality was somehow worse than any of her nightmares. David Chun, Sarah's father, flew back from Portland immediately. He'd remarried 3 years earlier and had tried to build a new life, but the news of Sarah's death brought all his grief flooding back. He and Elena met at the police station, 2 broken people trying to process the unthinkable. She was alive, Elena said, her voice hollow. She was alive for hours after the accident, and he just let her die. Rivera had seen a lot of family reactions to terrible news. But watching the Chuns process the details of their daughter's death was particularly difficult. They'd spent 14 years hoping for Sarah's return, imagining reunions and explanations, and happy endings. The truth was far more brutal than their worst fears. The search for Sarah's remains began immediately. David led investigators to the wooded area behind St. Michael's Church, where ground-penetrating radar eventually located the burial site. The remains were carefully excavated by forensic experts, a process that took 2 full days. After 14 years underground, there wasn't much left of Sarah's body, but it was enough to confirm David's story and provide the Chun family with the closure they'd been seeking. DNA analysis confirmed the identity, and a forensic examination of the bones revealed injuries consistent with David's account of the accident. Dr. Amanda Foster, the forensic pathologist who examined the remains, provided a detailed report to the police and the district attorney's office. The skull fracture was severe and would have been fatal even with immediate medical attention. But the other injuries, the broken arm, the internal bleeding, might have been survivable if Sarah had received proper medical care. The head injury was catastrophic, Dr. Foster told Rivera during her briefing, but the victim lived for several hours after the initial trauma. If she'd been taken to a hospital immediately, there's a small chance she might have survived. The revelation made David's actions seem even more heinous. He hadn't just caused an accident, he'd effectively murdered Sarah by denying her medical care. The news of the confession spread through Millbrook like wildfire. The small town had been consumed by Sarah's disappearance for 14 years, and the resolution of the case was front-page news in the local paper and the lead story on every regional news broadcast. Jenny Morrison, the newspaper editor who had covered the story from the beginning, found herself struggling to write about the conclusion. She'd spent 14 years speculating about what might have happened to Sarah, had written dozens of articles about the search efforts and the impact on the community. The truth was more horrifying than any of her theories. "I keep thinking about all the search parties," she told her assistant editor. "All the volunteers who spent weekends combing through the woods and searching abandoned buildings. Sarah was buried 50 yards from the church, where many of those searches were coordinated. The irony was devastating. St. Michael's Church had been a central location for the search efforts, with volunteers gathering in the sanctuary to receive assignments and share information. Elena Chun had attended prayer vigils in the same room, where her daughter's bracelet was hidden beneath the floorboards. Father Brennan was overwhelmed by the revelation. He'd served as a counselor and spiritual advisor to many families affected by Sarah's disappearance, had conducted memorial services and offered comfort to those who had lost hope. The idea that his church had been the site of Sarah's final hours was almost too much to bear. "I keep thinking about all the services I held in that sanctuary," he told Rivera during one of their conversations. "All the prayers, all the communion services, all the times I stood at that altar, not knowing what was hidden beneath my feet." The elderly priest found it increasingly difficult to conduct services in the sanctuary. He'd asked the church council to consider relocating worship to the fellowship hall while he processed his feelings about the revelation. The congregation was supportive, but many of them were struggling with their own emotions about the news. Margaret Sullivan, who had discovered the crucial evidence that broke the case, found no satisfaction in the revelation. She'd worked alongside David Hoffman during the repairs in 2010, had brought him coffee, and made small talk while he worked on the damaged floorboards. She'd never suspected that he was hiding such a terrible secret. "He seemed so normal," she told Rivera. "Just a quiet man doing his job. He was polite, professional, even helped me move some heavy boxes. I never would have imagined he was capable of something so horrible." A trial became a media sensation, drawing reporters from across the state and beyond. David Hoffman pleaded guilty to vehicular manslaughter and improper disposal of human remains, accepting a plea deal that would send him to prison for 12 years. The prosecution had initially sought charges of second-degree murder, arguing that David's failure to seek medical attention for Sarah constituted depraved indifference to human life. But District Attorney Rebecca Martinez ultimately decided that the vehicular manslaughter charge better reflected the nature of the crime. The accident itself hadn't been intentional, though David's subsequent actions had been reprehensible. The defendant made a series of terrible decisions that cost a young woman her life, Martinez said during the sentencing hearing. While the initial accident may have been just that, an accident, his choice to hide his actions and let Sarah Chun die without medical attention was inexcusable. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and members of the Millbrook community who had followed Sarah's case for 14 years. The Chun family sat in the front row, Elena flanked by her sister and her ex-husband David. They'd put aside their differences to face this final chapter of their daughter's story together. Elena's victim impact statement was devastating. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes about the 14 years of not knowing, about the way the mystery had consumed her life and destroyed her marriage. She talked about the sleepless nights, the false hopes, the gradual realization that Sarah was probably never coming home. "You didn't just take my daughter's life," Elena said, looking directly at David Hoffman. "You took 14 years of my life, my husband's life, our family's life. You took our ability to grieve properly, to say goodbye, to find peace." Elena spoke about Sarah's dreams, her love of music, and the recital that would never happen. She described the bedroom that had remained unchanged for 14 years, the piano that had gathered dust, the college applications that were never submitted. But in a moment that surprised everyone in the courtroom, Elena also spoke about forgiveness. She'd been working with a therapist and a spiritual counselor since David's confession, trying to process her anger and grief in a healthy way. "I can't forgive you today," she said, "but I hope that someday I can. Not because you deserve it, but because I need to be free from the hatred that's been eating me alive for 14 years. David wept openly as he listened to Elena's words. He'd spent the months since his confession in therapy, working through his addiction and the guilt that had controlled his life for so long. He'd written dozens of letters to the Chun family, letters he'd never sent, apologies he'd never been able to voice. When given the opportunity to speak, David's voice shook with emotion. "I think about Sarah every day," he said. "I think about the music she would have played, the life she would have lived, the family she might have had. I know I can't bring her back, and I know I can't undo what I did. But I hope that by telling the truth, I can at least give her family some peace." David's confession had also revealed the systematic failures in the original investigation. Detective Rivera had been haunted by these failures for months, analyzing every decision made during the initial search for Sarah. The police had focused heavily on the possibility of abduction, interviewing known sex offenders and searching for evidence of a struggle. They'd organized massive volunteer searches, but they'd concentrated on areas farther from town, assuming that anyone who had taken Sarah would have tried to get her as far away as possible. The wooded area behind St. Michael's Church had been searched, but only superficially. The searchers had walked through the woods, calling Sarah's name, but they hadn't looked for signs of recent digging or disturbed earth. If they had, they might have found her body within days of her disappearance. Rivera had also missed the significance of Robert Kellerman's report about the mysterious pickup truck. The information had been included in the case file, but it hadn't been followed up on thoroughly. A canvass of local auto repair shops and DMV records might have led them to David Hoffman years earlier. "We failed her," Rivera told his captain during one of their debriefings. "We failed Sarah, and we failed her family. If we'd been more thorough, more systematic, we might have solved this case in 2010. Captain Susan Moore had been with the department for 25 years and had seen her share of investigations gone wrong. She understood Rivera's guilt, but she also knew that dwelling on past mistakes wouldn't bring Sarah back. "Marcus, you were a rookie," she said. "You followed the procedures you were taught, and you did the best you could with the information you had. The real failure was systemic. We didn't have the resources or the training to handle a case like this properly." The revelation of David's confession had prompted a complete review of the department's missing person protocols. New procedures were implemented to ensure that accident scenarios were given equal consideration with abduction theories. The department also invested in better training for investigators and improved coordination with forensic experts. But for Rivera, the professional lessons learned felt insignificant compared to the personal cost. He'd built his career on the promise of bringing justice to victims and their families, and his failure to solve Sarah's case had undermined his confidence in ways that still affected his work. Detective Walsh had been watching her partner struggle with the guilt and self-recrimination that had consumed him since David's confession. She'd seen cops destroy themselves over cases they couldn't solve, and she was determined not to let that happen to Rivera. "You need to talk to someone," she told him one evening as they finished their paperwork. "A professional, not just the department counselor. This guilt is eating you alive, and it's not helping anyone." Walsh had her own experience with therapy. After the shooting that had ended her narcotics career, she'd learned the hard way that traumatic experiences could have long-lasting effects on mental health, and she'd seen too many good cops refuse to get help when they needed it. Rivera initially resisted the suggestion, but Elena Chun's words about forgiveness had stayed with him. If she could work toward forgiving David Hoffman for killing her daughter, maybe he could learn to forgive himself for failing to solve the case sooner. Meanwhile, the impact of Sarah's case continued to ripple through the community of Millbrook. The revelation that she'd been buried so close to the church that had coordinated many of the search efforts was particularly disturbing for the volunteers who had spent years looking for her. Tom Bradley had been one of the most dedicated volunteers, spending every weekend for 3 years searching wooded areas and abandoned buildings. He was a retired construction worker who had felt a personal connection to the case because his own daughter was close to Sarah's age. "I must have walked through those woods behind the church dozens of times," he told Jenny Morrison during an interview for the newspaper's follow-up coverage. "I was maybe 50 feet from where she was buried, and I never knew it." It makes you question everything about the search efforts. The psychological impact on the volunteers was significant. Many of them had devoted years of their lives to searching. For Sarah, had organized fundraisers and awareness campaigns, had never given up hope that she might be found alive. The revelation that she'd been dead within hours of her disappearance and buried so close to their base of operations was devastating. Dr. Patricia Sanderson, a psychologist who specialized in trauma counseling, was brought in to provide support for the volunteers and other community members affected by the case. She'd worked with families of missing persons before and understood the complex emotions involved in cases like Sarah's. There's often a sense of misplaced guilt when a missing person case is resolved this way, Dr. Sanderson explained to the community support group she'd organized. People feel like they should have done more, should have looked harder, should have somehow prevented the tragedy. But the truth is, everyone did the best they could with the information they had. The support group met weekly at the Millbrook Community Center, providing a safe space for people to process their emotions about the case. Elena Chun attended regularly, finding comfort in sharing her grief with others who had been affected by Sarah's disappearance. One of the most unexpected attendees was Ruth Hoffman, David's sister-in-law. She'd been caring for Charles, David's brother, since his Alzheimer's diagnosis, and she was struggling with her own guilt about David's actions. "I keep thinking I should have known," Ruth told the group during one of their sessions. "David was family, and I saw him regularly. How Could I not know he was capable of something so terrible? Dr. Sanderson helped the group understand that perpetrators of serious crimes often appear completely normal to those around them. David had functioned in society for 14 years after Sarah's death, had maintained relationships, and held steady employment. There was no reason for his family to suspect that he was hiding such a terrible secret. The case had also prompted a broader discussion about addiction and its role in criminal behavior. David's drug addiction hadn't caused him to kill Sarah, but it had impaired his judgment and led to the series of terrible decisions that had cost her life. Recovery advocate Maria Santos had been working with addicts in the Millbrook area for over a decade. She'd known David peripherally through the recovery community. He'd been clean for 8 years and had been a regular attendee at Narcotics Anonymous meetings. David's case illustrates how addiction can lead to catastrophic decisions, Santos explained to Community Group. When someone is under the influence, their ability to make rational, moral choices is severely compromised. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it helps explain how a person who wasn't inherently evil could make such horrible choices. The discussion about addiction and criminal behavior was difficult for many community members. Some felt that David's drug use was no excuse for his actions, while others saw it as a mitigating factor that helped explain his behavior. Elena Chun found herself somewhere in between these perspectives. She couldn't excuse David's actions, but she was trying to understand them as part of her own healing process. "I don't think David woke up that morning planning to kill my daughter," she told Dr. Sanderson during one of their individual sessions. "I think he was a sick man who made terrible choices while under the influence. That doesn't make it okay, but it helps me understand how it happened." The search for understanding extended to Sarah's school community as well. Millbrook High School had been deeply affected by her disappearance, with teachers and students organizing awareness campaigns and memorial events. The school had planted a tree in Sarah's memory and had established a scholarship fund for students pursuing music education. Principal Janet Wallace had been at the school for 25 years when Sarah disappeared. She'd known Sarah personally, had written letters of recommendation for her college applications, and had been devastated by her disappearance. Sarah was the kind of student every teacher hopes to have. Principal Wallace told the school board during a meeting about how to handle the news of the case's resolution. She was academically gifted, but more importantly, she was kind and compassionate. She had a bright future ahead of her. The school decided to hold a memorial service for Sarah, giving the community a chance to say goodbye properly. The service was held in the school auditorium, with hundreds of people in attendance. Mrs. Whitmore, despite her arthritis, played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the piece Sarah had been preparing for her recital. Elena Chun spoke at the service, sharing memories of her daughter and thanking the community for their support over the years. She also announced that the family would be establishing an expanded scholarship fund in Sarah's name, providing financial assistance to young musicians who might not otherwise be able to pursue their dreams. Sarah believed that music was the language of the heart, Elena said. She would want her legacy to be about nurturing that language in others, about helping young people discover the joy and beauty that music can bring to life. The scholarship fund was supported by donations from across the community, including an unexpected contribution from David Hoffman. He'd asked his attorney to donate his entire savings account to the fund, a gesture that prompted mixed reactions from the community. Some people saw it as a hollow gesture, a way for David to try to buy forgiveness. Others viewed it as a genuine attempt to do something positive in Sarah's memory. Elena Chun ultimately decided to accept the donation, saying that Sarah would have wanted the money to be used to help other young musicians. The renovation of St. Michael's Church was completed 6 months after Sarah's remains were found. The new flooring was installed, the heating system updated, and the sanctuary restored to its former beauty. But Father Brennan found it difficult to conduct services there, knowing the history that lay beneath the floor. The church council had discussed relocating worship services permanently, but ultimately decided to reconsecrate the sanctuary and continue using it for services. They installed a small memorial plaque near the altar, acknowledging Sarah's connection to the church and expressing their commitment to honoring her memory. Margaret Sullivan had been instrumental in the decision to install the memorial. She'd researched the church's history and found that other tragedies had occurred on the property over the years, but the congregation had always found ways to heal and move forward. This church has been a place of worship for over a century, Margaret told the council. It's seen births and deaths, joys and sorrows, celebrations and tragedies. Sarah's story is now part of our history, and we honor her by continuing to serve our community. The memorial service at the church was attended by people from all faiths and backgrounds, reflecting the way Sarah's story had touched the entire community. Father Brennan delivered a sermon about forgiveness and healing, drawing on his own struggle to come to terms with what had happened in his church. "We cannot change the past," he said. "We cannot bring Sarah back, and we cannot undo the choices that led to her death. But we can choose how we move forward. We can choose to honor her memory by supporting each other, by building a community where young people are safe and valued." The service included musical performances by local musicians, including several of Mrs. Whitmore's former students who had known Sarah. The final piece was a solo piano performance of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, played by a high school student who had received one of the first scholarships from the fund established in Sarah's name. As the music filled the sanctuary, Elena Chun felt something she hadn't experienced in 14 years, a sense of peace. The anger and desperation that had consumed her for so long were still there, but they were tempered now by acceptance and hope. David Hoffman began serving his sentence at the state penitentiary. 3 months after his sentencing, he was placed in protective custody initially, as crimes involving children often made inmates targets for violence. But after a psychological evaluation, he was moved to the general population and assigned to work in the prison's woodworking shop. The prison had programs for inmates struggling with addiction, and David became a regular participant in group therapy sessions. He also began corresponding with addiction counselors and speaking to other inmates about the consequences of drug use. "I can't change what I did," he wrote in a letter to his counselor, "but maybe I can help someone else avoid making the same mistakes. Maybe I can save someone else from destroying their life and hurting innocent people." David's letters to the Chun family continued, though he never sent them. They were part of his therapy, a way to process his guilt and work toward the forgiveness he didn't deserve but desperately needed. His counselor encouraged him to continue writing, even if the letters were never delivered. The letters revealed the depth of David's remorse and his understanding of the impact his actions had had on Sarah's family and the community. He wrote about his dreams, which were haunted by visions of Sarah. He wrote about his regret over the choices he'd made and his wish that he could somehow make amends. "I dream about her every night," he wrote in one letter. "I see her walking down Maple Street, wearing her headphones, completely innocent and unaware of what's about to happen. I tried to call out to her, to warn her, but she can't hear me. Then I wake up and remember that it's too late, that I can't change anything." Detective Rivera kept copies of David's confession and the case files on his desk, not as trophies, but as reminders of the responsibility he bore to every victim and their families. He'd begun working more closely with the families of missing persons, trying to provide them with the support and communication that the Chun family had lacked during their ordeal. Rivera had also become an advocate for changes in missing person investigation protocols. He'd spoken at law enforcement conferences about the lessons learned from Sarah's case, emphasizing the importance of considering all possibilities and maintaining thorough documentation. "We can't bring Sarah back," he told one audience of police officers. "But we can honor her memory by doing better for the next family, by being more thorough, more compassionate, more committed to finding the truth." The case had also led to improvements in interagency cooperation. The FBI had provided resources and expertise during the investigation, and those relationships had continued beyond the resolution of Sarah's case. The Millbrook Police Department now had better access to federal databases and forensic resources. That could help with future investigations. Detective Walsh had been promoted to sergeant 6 months after the case was closed, partly in recognition of her work on the investigation. She'd used her new position to implement training programs for officers dealing with missing person cases, drawing on her experience with Sarah's case to improve the department's response. The training included sessions on victim advocacy, family, communication, and the psychological impact of long-term missing person cases. Walsh wanted to ensure that future families wouldn't have to endure the same lack of information and support that had made the Chun family's ordeal even more difficult. "These cases don't just affect the victims," Walsh told her training classes. "They affect entire families, entire communities. We have a responsibility to handle them with the care and attention they deserve." The media attention surrounding Sarah's case had also led to increased awareness of missing person cases in general. Jenny Morrison, the newspaper editor who had covered the story from the beginning, had written a book about the case that became a bestseller. The book explored not only the details of Sarah's disappearance and death, but also the broader issues of addiction, criminal justice, and community healing. Morrison donated a portion of the book's proceeds to the scholarship fund, established in Sarah's name. She'd struggled with the ethics of profiting from tragedy, but ultimately decided that the book could serve as a tool for education and awareness. "Sarah's story needs to be told," Morrison said during a book signing event. "Not just the details of what happened to her, but the lessons we can learn from it. How addiction can lead to terrible choices, how communities can come together in times of crisis, how families can find healing even after the worst possible loss." The book had been optioned for a television movie, though Elena Chon had mixed feelings about that development. She wanted Sarah's story to be told respectfully, but she was concerned about the sensationalism that often accompanied true crime adaptations. "I want people to remember Sarah as the talented, kind young woman she was," Elena said, "not just as a victim of a terrible crime. Her life had value beyond the circumstances of her death." The Shun family had indeed found ways to honor Sarah's memory beyond the scholarship fund. Elena had returned to work part-time, using her marketing skills to help promote music education programs in local schools. She'd also become involved with organizations that supported families of missing persons, providing guidance and support to others facing similar situations. David Chun had eventually moved back to Millbrook, unable to stay away from the place where his daughter had lived and died. He'd divorced his second wife, recognizing that he needed to focus on his own healing before he could be a good partner to anyone else. The relationship between Elena and David remained complicated. They'd shared too much history and too much pain to simply return to friendship, but they'd found a way to support each other through the ongoing process of grief and healing. "We're not going to get back together," Elena told Dr. Sanderson during one of their sessions. "Too much has happened, and we've both changed too much. But we're the only two people who truly understand what we've lost, and that creates a bond that's hard to break." The two had begun meeting monthly for coffee, sharing memories of Sarah, and discussing the scholarship fund and other memorial activities. It was a fragile relationship, built on shared grief rather than romantic love, but it provided them both with a sense of connection to Sarah's memory. Mrs. Whitmore had been deeply affected by the resolution of Sarah's case. She'd spent 14 years wondering what had happened to her talented student, and the truth had been more horrible than she'd imagined. But she'd also found comfort in knowing that Sarah's musical dreams were being carried forward through the scholarship fund. "Sarah lives on through the music," Mrs. Whitmore told Elena during one of their conversations. "Every time a young person sits down at the piano and plays a piece that Sarah might have played, her spirit is there with them." Mrs. Whitmore had become a volunteer mentor for recipients of the Sarah Chun Scholarship, providing guidance and encouragement to young musicians who are pursuing their dreams. Despite her arthritis, she'd found ways to continue teaching, adapting her methods to accommodate her physical limitations. The scholarship recipients had formed a kind of extended family, united by their connection to Sarah's legacy. They performed together at annual memorial concerts, participated in community service projects, and supported each other through the challenges of pursuing careers in music. One of the scholarship recipients, a young woman named Ashley Martinez, had been particularly inspired by Sarah's story. She'd written a composition in Sarah's honor, a piece that incorporated elements of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the piece Sarah had been preparing for her recital. "I never met Sarah," Ashley said during one of the memorial concerts, "but her story has inspired me to pursue my dreams with passion and determination. I want to honor her memory by becoming the musician she never got the chance to be." The memorial concerts had become annual events, drawing audiences from across the region. The concerts featured performances by scholarship recipients, local musicians, and special guests who had been touched by Sarah's story. The events served as fundraisers for the scholarship fund and as opportunities for the community to come together in Sarah's memory. Father Brennan had found his own way to honor Sarah's memory. He'd begun incorporating discussions about forgiveness and healing into his sermons, drawing on his own struggle to come to terms with what had happened in his church. The congregation had responded positively to his vulnerability and honesty about his own journey of healing. The church had also established a crisis counseling program, providing support for community members dealing with trauma and grief. The program was staffed by trained volunteers and professional counselors, offering a safe space for people to process difficult emotions and experiences. Margaret Sullivan had taken on a leadership role in the counseling program, using her organizational skills and deep knowledge of the community to help connect people with the resources they needed. She'd also become a lay counselor herself, completing training programs and providing peer support to others who had experienced loss. Sarah's story taught me that tragedy can strike anyone, anywhere, Margaret told the volunteers during one of their training sessions. But it also taught me that communities can heal and grow stronger when people support each other through difficult times. The counseling program had helped dozens of community members deal with various forms of trauma and loss. The staff had developed expertise in dealing with complicated grief, the kind of prolonged mourning that often accompanies cases involving missing persons or unresolved deaths. Dr. Sanderson had continued her work with the community, establishing a permanent practice in Millbrook to serve families affected by trauma. She'd found that Sarah's case had opened up conversations about mental health and healing that had been needed in the community for years. Sarah's story became a catalyst for healing that extended far beyond her immediate family, Dr. Sanderson observed. It gave people permission to talk about their own losses and traumas, to seek help, and to support each other in ways that hadn't happened before. The case had also prompted changes in how the community dealt with addiction. Maria Santos had expanded her recovery programs, working with local law enforcement and healthcare providers to create a more comprehensive approach to addiction treatment and prevention. David's case showed us that addiction can lead to consequences that extend far beyond the addict themselves, Santos explained to the community coalition she'd helped establish. "We need to address addiction as a public health issue, not just a criminal justice issue. The coalition had implemented drug education programs in local schools, expanded access to treatment services, and established support groups for families affected by addiction. They'd also worked to reduce the stigma associated with addiction, encouraging people to seek help before their problems led to tragic consequences. 10 years after David's confession, the impact of Sarah's case continued to be felt throughout Millbrook. The scholarship fund had grown substantially, supporting dozens of young musicians in their pursuit of education and careers. The memorial concerts had become beloved community traditions, and the crisis counseling program had helped hundreds of people. Elena Chun had found a measure of peace that had seemed impossible in the years immediately following Sarah's disappearance. She'd never fully recovered from the loss no parent could, but she'd learned to live with her grief in a way that honored Sarah's memory while allowing her to find joy in other aspects of life. "I still think about Sarah every day," Elena told Dr. Sanderson during one of their sessions. "But now I think about the life she lived, not just the way she died. I remember her laugh, her determination, her kindness. I remember the music she played and the dreams she had." Elena had begun dating again, tentatively exploring the possibility of companionship in her later years. She'd met Robert, a widower who had lost his wife to cancer several years earlier. They'd connected over their shared understanding of loss and their commitment to honoring the memory of those they'd loved. "I'll always love Sarah's father," Elena told Robert early in their relationship. "And I'll always love Sarah, but I'm learning that the heart has room for many different kinds of love, and that honoring the past doesn't mean I can't embrace the future." David Hoffman had served 8 years of his 12-year sentence when he was granted parole. His behavior in prison had been exemplary, and he'd completed every available program for addiction recovery and personal development. He'd also become a mentor to other inmates, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the consequences of drug use. The parole hearing had been attended by Elena Chun, who had chosen to speak on David's behalf. Her decision had surprised many in the community, including David himself, but she'd felt compelled to advocate for his release. "I don't forgive David for what he did to my daughter," Elena had told the parole board. "I may never be able to do that, but I've seen the work he's done to change his life, and I believe he's learned from his mistakes. Keeping him in prison longer won't bring Sarah back, and it won't serve any purpose for justice or healing." David's release had been controversial in the community. Some people felt that he hadn't served enough time for his crimes, while others supported Elena's position that he deserved a chance at redemption. The debate had highlighted the complex emotions surrounding forgiveness and justice in cases involving such profound loss. Upon his release, David had moved to a halfway house in a neighboring county, wanting to begin his reintegration into society, away from the immediate scrutiny of the Millbrook community. He'd found work with a construction company that specialized in hiring former inmates, and he'd continued his participation in recovery programs. David had also begun speaking at schools and community organizations about the dangers of drug use and the importance of making responsible choices. His presentations were powerful and emotional, drawing on his personal experience to illustrate the devastating consequences that could result from impaired judgment. "I made a choice to use drugs." On October 15, 2010, David would tell his audiences. That choice led to a series of other choices that cost an innocent young woman her life and destroyed multiple families. "I can't change what I did, but I can try to prevent others from making the same mistakes." The presentations had been well received, and David had begun to develop a reputation as an effective advocate for addiction prevention. He'd partnered with recovery organizations and law enforcement agencies to create programs that emphasized the real-world consequences of drug use. Rivera had attended one of David's presentations, finding it both difficult and compelling to hear. the man who had committed the crime that had haunted his career for so long. He'd been surprised by David's apparent sincerity and his detailed understanding of the impact his actions had had on others. I still struggle with anger toward him, Rivera had told Walsh after the presentation. But I have to admit that he seems genuinely committed to making amends. Maybe that's the best we can hope for in a situation like this. The case had continued to influence Rivera's work long after its resolution. He'd become a specialist in missing person cases, developing expertise that had helped solve several other long-term investigations. He'd also become a resource for other law enforcement agencies dealing with similar cases. Rivera had written articles for police journals about the lessons learned from Sarah's case, emphasizing the importance of thorough investigation techniques and family communication. He'd also testified before state legislative committees about the need for better resources and training for missing person investigations. Every missing person case is someone's Sarah, Rivera had told one legislative committee. Every unsolved case is a family living in limbo, unable to heal or move forward. We owe it to these families to do everything we can to find the truth. The legislative testimony had led to increased funding for missing person investigations and the establishment of a statewide database for sharing information between agencies. The improvements had already helped solve several cases that might otherwise have remained unsolved. Detective Walsh had continued to work with Rivera on missing person cases, and their partnership had become one of the most effective in the state. They'd developed protocols and techniques that had been adopted by other agencies, and they'd trained hundreds of officers in best practices for missing person investigations. Sarah's case taught us that every detail matters, Walsh had told a group of new detectives during a training session. A seemingly insignificant piece of information can be the key to solving a case. We have to be thorough, we have to be persistent, and we have to never give up on finding the truth. The training programs had emphasized the importance of victim advocacy and family communication, areas where the original investigation of Sarah's case had been lacking. The new protocols ensured that families were kept informed of developments and that their needs were considered throughout the investigation. Mrs. Whitmore had continued her work with the scholarship recipients until her death at age 81. She'd lived to see dozens of young musicians benefit from the program, and she'd taken great pride in their achievements. Her funeral had been attended by hundreds of people, including many of her former students who had gone on to successful careers in music. In her will, Mrs. Whitmore had left her piano to the scholarship fund, with the stipulation that it be used for performances and recitals by scholarship recipients. The piano had been moved to the Millbrook Community Center, where it served as the centerpiece for the annual memorial concerts. The piano had become a symbol of Sarah's legacy, representing the music she'd never had the chance to play and the dreams she'd never had the opportunity to fulfill. Each time a scholarship recipient sat down to play it, they were connecting with Sarah's memory and carrying forward her love of music. Ashley Martinez, the scholarship recipient who had written the composition in Sarah's honor, had gone on to attend the prestigious New England Conservatory of Music. She'd continued to perform her tribute piece at memorial concerts and other events, and she'd begun work on a full-length composition that would tell Sarah's story through music. Sarah's story isn't just about tragedy, Ashley had explained to Elena during one of their conversations. It's about the power of music to heal, to connect people, and to keep memories alive. I want my composition to capture all of that, the sadness, but also the hope and the love. The composition had been commissioned by the Millbrook Symphony Orchestra for the 50th anniversary of Sarah's disappearance. The premiere performance had been attended by hundreds of people, including many who had been involved in the original search efforts and the subsequent investigation. Elena had sat in the front row for the premiere, surrounded by friends and family members who had supported her through the long journey of grief and healing. As the music played, she'd felt Sarah's presence in a way that was both comforting and bittersweet. Sarah would have loved this, Elena had whispered to David, who was sitting beside her. She would have been so proud to know that her story inspired something so beautiful. The composition had been recorded and released as a fundraising album for the Scholarship Fund, with proceeds supporting the next generation of young musicians. The album had been well received by critics and audiences alike, with many reviewers noting the emotional power of the music and the inspiring story behind it. Father Brennan had retired from active ministry 2 years after Sarah's case was resolved, but he'd continued to live in Millbrook and remain involved with the St. Michael's congregation. He'd found peace with the church's history and had become an advocate for restorative justice and healing-centered approaches to crime and punishment. Sarah's case taught me that healing is possible even after the most terrible tragedies, Father Brennan had said during his retirement ceremony. It taught me that communities can come together to support each other through the darkest times, and that love and forgiveness can triumph over hatred and despair. The church had continued to serve as a gathering place for memorial events and community healing activities. The memorial plaque honoring Sarah had become a place of quiet reflection, where people could come to remember her and think about the importance of making choices that honor life and dignity. Margaret Sullivan had been elected to the church council and had continued her work with the crisis counseling program. She'd also become involved in victim advocacy, working with law enforcement agencies to improve their response to families affected by crime. Sarah's case showed me that every person has the potential to make a difference, Margaret had told a group of new volunteers. We can't always prevent tragedies from happening, but we can be there for each other when they do. We can choose to respond with compassion and support rather than fear and isolation. The Victim Advocacy Program had expanded beyond Millbrook, with Margaret serving as a consultant to other communities developing similar programs. She'd helped establish support networks for families of missing persons, crime victims, and others affected by tragedy. 15 years after Sarah's disappearance, the small town of Millbrook had been transformed by her story. The case had exposed weaknesses in the criminal justice system and had led to improvements in how missing person cases were handled. It had also brought the community together in ways that had created lasting bonds and support networks. The Scholarship Fund had grown to over $500,000, supporting dozens of young musicians each year. The memorial concerts had become regional events, drawing audiences from across the state and raising awareness about the importance of music education. The crisis counseling program had helped hundreds of people deal with trauma and loss, and the Victim Advocacy Program had provided support to families affected by crime. The addiction prevention programs had reached thousands of young people, potentially preventing future tragedies. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah's story had become a testament to the power of love, forgiveness, and community healing. Elena Chun had found a way to honor her daughter's memory while building a life that included joy and hope. David Hoffman had worked to make amends for his terrible choices and had dedicated his life to preventing others from making similar mistakes. The community of Millbrook had learned that healing was possible, even after the worst possible loss, and that working together to support each other through difficult times could create something beautiful and lasting. As Elena Chun sat in her living room on the 50th anniversary of Sarah's disappearance, she looked at the piano that had once been her daughter's pride and joy. The instrument was still there, still in tune, still waiting for someone to play it. Elena approached the piano slowly, her fingers trembling as she touched the keys. She hadn't played in years, but she remembered the simple melodies that Sarah had taught her when she was first learning. As she played, she felt Sarah's presence in the room, felt her daughter's love and approval. The music was simple, imperfect, but it was filled with love and memory. It was a mother's tribute to her daughter, a promise that Sarah's legacy would continue to inspire and heal others for generations to come. In the quiet notes that filled the room, Sarah Chun's story found its true ending, not in tragedy and loss, but in love, hope, and the eternal power of music to heal the human heart. The bracelet that had hidden the truth for 14 years had become a symbol of justice and closure. But more importantly, it had become a reminder that every life has value and that love can transcend even the darkest circumstances. The story of Sarah Chun had begun with a mother's worst nightmare, but it had evolved into something more testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of community to heal and grow stronger in the face of unimaginable loss.